Thank you so much to all of you for joining us this evening. For those of you who don't recognize my voice, this is Christine Butkus welcoming you from the Early Childhood Educators of BC's offices in downtown Vancouver. And we're really excited to be hosting our second webcast with the University of Victoria. And at this point, I'm going to shift voices here because we had some sound challenges. You can picture Professor Alan Pence speaking now, and I'm going to read you a prepared message from Alan. Alan says, it's great to see all of you here and at Capilano University campus and online for this presentation by Professor Peter Moss. By way of introduction, I could flag how Peter has been making fantastic contributions to the world of early childhood education, care, and development for many decades, from post-structural critiques, including the very rich Contesting Early Childhood series, to parental leave policies, and from undertaking significant historical work regarding Loris Malaguzzi to challenging the OECD's recently proposed early learning study as part of the PISA process. Peter has been a force in the early years field for many decades, a fact that I am delighted the University of Victoria will recognize through awarding an honorary PhD to Peter at a future UVic convocation. The fact that Peter is joining us this evening, 2 a.m. local time, is a testament to his ongoing commitment to ECD globally. I asked him if there was anything in particular he wished me to note in my introduction, and he said, the shorter the better. So in keeping with Peter's wishes and in recognition of his having arisen very early to be with us, I'll pass the microphone to my dear friend and colleague, Peter Moss. Over to you, Peter.
Okay, so can I just check that you can hear me and see me in my PowerPoint?
We can.
Good, okay. Well, many thanks to Alan for that introduction. It's very good to hear those words from him. And welcome to all of you from my home in North London, where the time is now 2 o'clock in the morning. I think I just want to say that you should see my email address on the PowerPoint there, and that if you want a copy of my PowerPoint, I'm very happy to send it to you if you contact me, or indeed if you want to discuss further anything that I raise in the course of the next hour or so. So do feel free to contact me at that email address. I'd also like to draw your attention to the brackets in my title around early childhood. The brackets are a reminder that Loris Malaguzzi wanted to renew all education and not just early childhood education, and his ideas and practice are relevant as much to compulsory education as they are to early childhood education. Moreover, I think it's important to remember that unless we renew and transform compulsory education, early childhood education will always struggle to evolve and maintain its own identity, and indeed have a strong and equal relationship with compulsory school education. If compulsory school education does not change, the risk is that early childhood education will suffer from schoolification, if indeed it is not already doing so. And finally, on this point, I think it's important to remember that Loris Malaguzzi and the Schools of Reggio Emilia are just one example of progressive education, a tradition that reaches back for many years and has found expression across all sectors of the education across all sectors of education. So although we will focus this evening on early childhood education, I think it's important to realize that this is just part of a wider discussion about education from birth to 18 and beyond. So with those initial thoughts in mind, let me just tell you a bit about my plan for the next hour or so. Oops, I'm trying to get my, no, sorry, there's a slight glitch here as to why my PowerPoint isn't moving. Oh, okay, I'm sorry about that. I hope you can see that now. I want to cover three parts in my presentation this evening. First of all, I want to talk about the importance of narratives or stories and the dominance of a particular narrative in today's early childhood education. I'll then give a short introduction to Loris Malaguzzi and his life, and then I'll finish by arguing that transformative change needs new narratives, and Loris Malaguzzi can help us because he created and enacted an alternative narrative. I also want to draw in the next hour on a recent book called Loris Malaguzzi and the Schools of Reggio Emilia, and the subtitle tells you about its contents. The subtitle is a selection of writings and speeches from 1945 to 1993. And this is a unique collection of his work, which had not appeared before in the English language. It's a collaboration between a working group in Reggio Emilia, including Paolo Cagliari, Marina Castagnetti, Via Vecchi, Carlina Rinaldi, and others. Jane McCall, a very, very experienced and excellent translator. Leverhulme Trust in Britain, who provide the funding for this venture. Routledge, the publisher of the book, and myself. And the book is based on an archive of more than 400 documents collected in Reggio Emilia's Documentation and Educational Research Centre. And from those more than 400 documents, the Reggio Emilia Working Group have selected just over 100 documents to appear in the book, which is actually divided into 5 chronological chapters from 1945. And in each chapter, you'll find an introduction about the historical context of the period and Loris Malaguzzi's life, and then a selection of documents from that period. I modestly think it's a must-read for those who want to go deeper into the early childhood education and schools of Reggio Emilia. And as I've said, it provides a unique collection of Loris Malaguzzi's work, which is not otherwise available. So let me move on to the first part of my presentation, the importance of narratives and the dominance of a particular narrative today in early childhood education. Let me start by explaining why I think narratives or stories are important. And I would start by picking up the conclusion or the idea of Jerome Bruner, who says that mankind has an innate tendency to communicate and to make sense of existence through stories. So stories are how we explain ourselves to others, how we explain the world to ourselves, how we make sense of things. And that idea is expressed by the Dark Mountain Project, an ecological collective based in the United States, when they say it is through stories that we weave reality. But they then go on to say that the dominant stories in their field, that is ecology and environment, and the reality that they weave are losing credibility and appeal. Just to develop that theme, this is what they say about the stories about the environment. We have stopped believing the stories our civilization tells itself as the world enters an age of ecological collapse, material contraction, and social and political unraveling. Stories that have told us that humanity is separate from all other life and destined to control it, that the ecological and economic crises we face are mere technical glitches, that anything which cannot be measured cannot matter. We see them falling apart before our eyes. So just as there is a dominant narrative or story about the environment and mankind's relationship to it, so too I think there is a dominant story today in early childhood education. And it's a dominant story that elsewhere I have called the story of quality and high returns. What is that story? In a nutshell, the story of quality and high returns goes something like this. Apply the correct human technologies, also known as quality, at the correct time, and you will get high returns on your investment. Improved education, improved employment, higher earnings, and a reduction in social problems. And then we all live happily ever after. Or we can express the story as an equation. Quality plus early intervention brings increased human capital and reduced dysfunction. Now, I've highlighted in this slide two terms, human technologies and human capital. Let me explain them in more detail, as I think they're very important in today's dominant narrative, the way in which a lot of people discuss early childhood education. And the first of these terms is human technologies. Now, when we think of technologies, we tend to think of, I don't know, gadgets, gizmos, mechanical and electrical things. But technologies are also about forms of human behavior, forms of human relationships. And that has been described very well, I think, by the British social theorist Nicholas Rose. He describes human technologies as technologies of government for the shaping of conduct in the hope of producing certain desired effects and averting certain undesired events. So these are ways in which we as human beings behave to other human beings to shape their conduct, to get certain effects or outcomes and stop certain events which we don't want from happening. And if we look in early childhood education, there are many examples today of these human technologies. I've put just a few on this slide. For example, child development concepts and knowledge, developmental and learning goals, prescriptive or very detailed curricula, pedagogical programs such as developmentally appropriate practice, child observation techniques, inspection regimes, standardized assessment or testing, which is very prevalent, it seems to me, in the world today of early childhood, and datafication, the increasing collection of data from children and teachers and others, which enables their control and management. Now, each of these technologies by itself is quite potent. Put them all together and you really have a very powerful machine, a very powerful way of shaping human conduct. And then human capital, which is often, I think, associated with the work of the US economist James Heckman, who is extremely influential today in early childhood education. You'll see his name mentioned very frequently. And education in general is increasingly defined as a process of human capital formation, which means the acquisition of skills and competencies and attitudes considered essential for individual and national competitiveness. Now, early years, it is argued by people like James Heckman, is the best time to invest in developing human capital. You get the most bangs for your bucks if you invest them at that early stage of life. And this kind of is, this idea is captured in these words from a British Minister of Education who gave a speech in which he said, the 21st century will belong to those countries that win the global race for jobs and economic advantage. In order for every adult to fulfill their potential, they need to be properly equipped with essential skills from the very beginning of their lives. So if the individual and the country is to survive in the global race. It's not quite certain what happens to those who won't survive, but if they are to survive, they've got to be imbued with these essential skills from birth. Now, I talked about this dominant story of quality and high returns. Let me just give you a few examples of people who tell this story. I have quite a collection, and this is just a small selection. And the first one comes from OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Again, another very influential voice in today's early childhood education. They have just started a cross-national study assessing a variety of cognitive and social skills in 5-year-olds as part of a new international early learning study, which will be related to PISA, the study of 15-year-olds, which has been going on for some time. So these are OECD is a very important player. It is shaping policy internationally and nationally. And they wrote a report in 2011, and they put the story of quality and high returns like this. Looking at early childhood education and care as an investment makes sense because the costs today generate many benefits in the future. Economists, such as Nobel Prize winner James Heckman, have shown how early learning is a good investment because it provides the foundation for later learning. The big insight from these economists, and notice how much economists now figure in early childhood education. The big insight from these economists is that $1, a euro, or a yen spent on preschool programs generates a higher return on investment than the same spending on later schooling. But early childhood education and care needs to be of sufficient quality to achieve beneficial child outcomes and yield longer-term social and economic gains. Or we can turn to the Obama White House of 2013, a press release to coincide with Obama's State of the Union speech in that year. Research has shown that taxpayers receive a high average return on investments in high quality early childhood education, with savings in areas like improved educational outcomes, increased labour productivity, and a reduction in crime. And that, of course, is just a small selection of the many outcomes, the many returns that are claimed for early childhood education, covering things like reducing addiction, many, many different outcomes are claimed for this investment in high quality early childhood education. And finally, a visual story. This is the front cover of a report written for the UK government back in 2011. You can see on the left-hand side 2 images of brains. The top one is a nice, plump, juicy one, presumably a very healthy 3-year-old brain, and the bottom is a sort of wizened, walnut-like brain, which has suffered apparently extreme neglect. This is taken from a research report from a Texas academic. It's a bit uncertain exactly where he got these images from. On the other side, you will see gold ingots, giving you some idea of the returns you can hope to get. And you can see the title of the report is Early Intervention, Smart Investment and Massive Savings. And those savings will include improving attainment, reducing benefits paid out, reducing teen pregnancy, reducing violent crime, increasing life expectancy, or drink and drug abuse will be reduced. You name it, you will get this benefit. Well, may just have gathered by this stage that I don't particularly like the story of quality and high returns. And let me tell you why not. The first reason is incredulity. I just don't believe it. I don't believe it works in its own terms if you take the bigger picture. Let's take the example of your neighbour, the United extensive early intervention programs, huge number of research studies on early intervention, and yet there's no evidence, if you look at the US as a country, that there have been any high returns. Child poverty in the United States remains as high as it was in 1964 when Head Start was introduced. Wages have stagnated over the last 30 years. The United States is near the bottom on all child well-being tables, international child well-being tables that I've seen. In fact, the picture that emerges from the US is quite disgraceful for a country that is the wealthiest in the developed world, at least among countries of any size. So I just don't believe it, that actually quality early intervention delivers all these amazing returns that we're told it will do. And the reason I think this lack of effect is because the story of quality and high returns is naive and reductionist. It's based on the belief that a technical fix, in other words, quality early childhood education, can solve deep structural and political problems that are caused by inequality and injustice. The story is a fairy tale. It's an example of magical thinking. And I think this magical thinking is well described by Ed Ziegler, who was one of the founders in 1964 of the American Head Start program. He was asked in 2004, on the 40th anniversary of Head Start, to write a short piece about the program. And he titled his short article, 40 Years of Believing in Magic is Enough. There is no magical permanent cure, he writes, for the problems associated with poverty. Expecting the achievement gap to be eliminated by early intervention is relying too much on the fairy godmother. Are we sure there's no magic potion that will push poor children into the ranks of the middle class? Only if that potion contains healthcare, childcare, good housing, sufficient income, child-rearing environments free of drugs and violence, support for parents in all their roles, and equal education for all students in school. Without these necessities, only magic will make that happen. Two other reasons I don't like the story. First of all, it seems to me it leads to ever-increasing governing of children and adults, because the drive to get high returns, especially when they don't appear, leads to ever stronger governing of children and adults to ensure that human technologies are correctly applied to them. As Edward Mellish, a British psychologist, puts it, very tightly defined programs produce good results. So to get good results, you've got to have these very tightly defined programs. You've got to make sure that children and adults are very carefully governed. And my final problem is that the story of quality and high returns contains a very impoverished view or image of the child and the teacher as passive, as needy, as unready, and as poor. And we'll come back to the image of the poor child in a bit. So I think here we have another example, like the example of the Dark Mountain Project's story about environment. We have another example of a dominant story losing credibility and appeal, although it remains very powerful. I also think it's important to ask what next. What next is transformative change, and transformative change certainly needs critique, the sort I've been providing, but there are many others. But also it needs other stories to be told about early childhood education. Because as the environmental campaigner George Monbiot puts it, the only thing that can displace a story is a story. And Loris Malaguzzi can help us create other stories. And also, equally important, he can help us enact them. And that leads me to the second part of my presentation, a short introduction to Loris Malaguzzi and his life. Now, Loris Malaguzzi was born in 1920, died in 1994. His life very much coincided with what historians call the short 20th century, the period starting with the First World War and ending with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Malaguzzi is born shortly after the end of the First World War. In his early years, Italy falls under the authoritarian rule of fascism and Benito Mussolini. So his childhood and despair. In 1939, the World War breaks out and Italy joins in the next year. In 1943, Italy surrenders and the Nazis occupy northern Italy, including Reggio Emilia. An Italian resistance breaks out, and for the next 2 years there is a very bloody struggle between the German occupied and Italian resistance. Something like 35,000 Italians are killed within a short period. 1945 comes liberation to northern Italy, including Reggio. And then the 50s and 60s see Italy entering an economic miracle, a great period of booming industry, rapid growth. The 70s sees a period of great political instability, the Anni di Piombo, the years of lead, where 3,000 politicians and others were assassinated. It's a very turbulent period. The 1980s is the period of the rise of neoliberalism across the Western world, including Italy. And then towards the end of Malaguzzi's life, we have the amazing episode of the fall of the Berlin Wall, followed by the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So he lives in fascinating, awful, interesting, dreadful, fascinating times. Malaguzzi trains as a teacher and as a psychologist, and in his early adult life he works in primary, secondary and adult education. He spends some years, for example, teaching former prisoners of war and partisans in an adult education college run as a cooperative. But he's most of his adult working life is as an employee of the commune or city of Reggio Emilia. He's a local official, if you like, a public official. He works, first of all, in a centre for school children with psychological difficulties. He spends a lot of time in summer camps, which are very common in Italy, in the mountains or at the seaside. Children go there in the summer for 2 or 3 weeks. And Malaguzzi spends quite a lot of time working on the pedagogy of summer camps. But he's mostly known for his work in the municipal schools of Reggio Emilia. I stress municipal to emphasize that these are schools run by the commune, the city, the local government. They are public schools. And the first one is opened in 1963. It's a school for children from 3 to 6. Others follow, and in 1971, they open their first school for children under 3, and then more of those schools follow. Malaguzzi is first of all a consultant to the schools and then becomes the director of the municipal schools. In 1981, Reggio Emilia's exhibition opens in Stockholm, and this, if you like, is Reggio Emilia's opening to the rest of the world. And that exhibition travels around the world, continues to do so today. It has just closed, for example, after 6 months in Seattle, and has just travelled across the United States to Boston. In 1985, Malaguzzi officially retires, but he remains extremely active in Reggio Emilia, in Italy, and travelling more and more around Europe and indeed to the rest of the world. And in his last 3 years of life, he and Reggio Emilia receive a number of prestigious awards. Newsweek, the magazine, nominates the Diana School in Reggio Emilia as one of the best in the world. Malaguzzi gets the Lego Prize and then the Cole International Teaching Award. Now, I think it's important to understand that Loris Malaguzzi and the schools of Reggio Emilia evolve in a very distinctive political, social, cultural and economic context. In particular, Reggio Emilia is a city in a region of Italy called Emilia-Romagna, which has been very much dominated since the war by left-wing politics. The Communist Party of Italy, the PCI, had a mass membership in that region. And the PCI, the Communists, governed many towns and cities in that region and elsewhere in northern and central Italy. They gained a reputation for honest, efficient and progressive government. And these cities, these comuni, like Reggio Emilia, were active not only in education, in early childhood education, but in many fields. They worked to improve the lives of citizens. They were busy in environment, in housing, in culture, in lots of areas. And Loris Malaguzzi, soon after the war, joined the Communist Party. He writes, "I knew nothing about politics, about Marx or Lenin or Gramsci or Togliatti. The last two are leaders of the Communist Party in Italy. But I was sure I was taking the side of the weakest, and I was joining the people who carried most hope when I joined the PCI." So he certainly didn't join the PCI as a passive follower. There are several speeches in the book I mentioned earlier in which he condemns the Communist Party for its failings. He's very prepared to be critical, although at the same time he recognizes that they are a very important force for progressive change in Italy. But the context is also can be seen in other ways. As well as being a communist area, this area of Italy has a very dynamic capitalist economy based on small and medium enterprises. It's a very successful economy. It also has a very strong cooperative movement going back well over 100 years. And it's also a region of high social capital, to use the term coined by Robert Putnam, the American sociologist, by which he meant a place with dense networks of civic associations or clubs, groups, societies, all sorts of local associations and organizations which have the ability to instill habits of cooperation, solidarity and public spiritedness. Now, Enzo Gattasi, a friend of Loris Malaguzzi's, puts it this way, that Malaguzzi's ideas and work were influenced by his participation in the struggles of democratic and progressive movements and by various examples of cooperative education. And indeed, the municipal schools of Reggio Emilia are part of a municipal school revolution that swept many towns and cities across northern Italy in the 1960s. What these towns and cities said in that decade was that we're not happy with the only schools that exist for young children and are run by the church. We don't think those are good enough. We can't wait for the national government in Rome to decide whether or not it's going to provide schools. So we, the local cities and towns, will take responsibility for the education of our young children. So what they did, I think, was to create their own distinct narratives and, equally important, put them to work. They enacted their narratives as local cultural projects of children. Quite often here today, the term the Reggio Emilia approach, which I personally don't use because I think it carries the implication that Reggio Emilia is a sort of plan or blueprint that you can export, you can buy into, and that you can simply apply in your neck of the woods. But as I've tried to explain, the municipal schools of Reggio Emilia come out of a very particular context. And they are, I think, a local cultural project. People in that city have worked on their education as a cultural project and evolved it over time within their very particular context. So how did Loris Malaguzzi and the schools of Reggio Emilia create their own narrative and enact it so successfully? Let me turn now via this picture from I think 1974 of Loris Malaguzzi talking to hundreds of school workers, parents and citizens. You can see the degree of involvement and activism there was in Reggio Emilia at that time. Let me turn via that photograph to the third part of my presentation. The argument that transformative change needs new narratives, and Loris Malaguzzi can help us because he created and enacted a new narrative. How did he do that? Well, first and foremost, because Malaguzzi and indeed others in Reggio Emilia understand that education is a political discourse or practice that requires asking political questions and making political choices. We create narratives, we weave stories from those political choices. And I would argue that Malaguzzi and Reggio Emilia have created a narrative which I would call the story of democracy, experimentation, and potentiality, in stark contrast to the story of quality and high returns. Now, Malaguzzi and the schools of Reggio Emilia provoke us, I hope and think, to ask political questions and make political choices, and therefore create our own narratives. Now, Malaguzzi has created his narrative. He provokes us, I think, to create our own narratives. But before I go on to look at his story, his narrative in more detail, let me just say a bit more about what I mean by political questions and political choices. The Belgian political scientist Chantal Mouffe describes political questions as not mere technical issues to be solved by experts, but questions that involve decisions that require us to make choices between conflicting alternatives. So we can have technical questions. My central heating doesn't work, so I have a question for an expert, a plumber. How do I repair my central heating? And the expert will be able to give me a technical answer to a technical question. There's only one correct answer to a technical question. But a political question is different because there can be a number of conflicting alternative answers. And that means that we have to make choices between those alternatives. And Malaguzzi is very well aware of this, as they all are in Reggio Emilia. He writes, pedagogy is always a political discourse, whether we know it or not. It clearly means working with political choices. Now, what are those political choices, and what are those political questions, and what are those political choices? Well, here are some of what I think are Malaguzzi's political questions. And I suppose the question for you all tonight is, what are your political questions? What is the diagnosis of our time? What image of the child, of the educator, of the early childhood centre? What is knowledge, and how do we learn? What is education, and what is education for? What is a commensurate pedagogy? In other words, what is a pedagogy appropriate to our choice about knowledge, learning and education? What are the fundamental values of education? What ethics do we work with in education? And what kind of society do we want? What do we want for our children here and now and in the future? Now, there are too many questions there for me to cover them all this evening. So I'm just going to pick out a few just to sort of give a flavour, an idea of the political choices that Malaguzzi and Reggio Emilia have made in creating their narrative. First of all, what is the diagnosis of our time? What do we think is going on? And for Loris Malaguzzi, it is essential to locate education in a broad analysis or understanding of the times we live in. We can't just close off early childhood education and ignore the wider world. We can't cocoon children. We can't pretend that they exist in a vacuum. He puts it very starkly, I think. Our conception of pedagogy is dynamic, not mummified. I think it's important to note that for him, the idea of a dynamic pedagogy, of movement in pedagogy, is critical. Either pedagogy, like all human sciences, is remade, reconstructed and updated based on the new conditions of the times, or it loses its nature, its function, its proper capacity to correspond to the times it lives in, and above all, to foresee, anticipate and prepare the days of tomorrow. So, to create a new narrative for early childhood, we need to ask, what is our diagnosis of what is happening in the world? What is our diagnosis of the conditions of the times? And how do we make education, early childhood education and all education, relevant to that diagnosis? The second question I'm going to pick up on is, I think, quite well known and rather famous Reggio Emilia question: what is our image of the child? To Loris Malaguzzi, this was absolutely central, as he puts it, towards the end of his life, but he believed this throughout his working life. A declaration about the image of the child is not only a necessary act of clarity and correctness, it is the necessary premise for any pedagogical theory and any pedagogical project. In other words, you can't really proceed with pedagogical work, with pedagogical projects, unless you are clear about your image of the child, and that involves making a choice. And Malaguzzi and Reggio Emilia make a very clear political choice here. There are rich children and poor children, says Loris Malaguzzi. We in Reggio Emilia say all children are rich. There are no poor children. All children, whatever their culture, whatever their lives, are rich, better equipped, more talented, stronger and more intelligent than we can suppose. So I think there's a very strong words that actually, if taken seriously, have profound implications for early childhood education, all education, in fact. So these rich children are protagonists, and the word protagonist figures very often in Malaguzzi's writings and speeches. The idea of protagonist is of being an active participant, somebody engaged, somebody who is not just passive. Rich children are born with 100 languages, although, of course, he says, under our current education system, they lose 98. Rich children are born competent and born learning. They are not bottles to be filled, he writes, but active in co-constructing the self and knowledge through social interactions and interdependencies. They are not bearers of needs, but bearers of rights, values, and competencies. Let me move on to what image of the early childhood centre. Again, Malaguzzi's choices are very clear. First of all, his choices about what early childhood centres are not. They are not childcare centres, although it says, of course, that centres in Reggio Emilia must adapt to factory life. Of course, he says, our early childhood centres must acknowledge that our parents are working in offices and factories and they must be open accordingly. But once you've said that, that's not very important or interesting. That's not the main reason why we provide early childhood centres. Early childhood centres for us are not selling products to parent consumers. I'm afraid an image which is very common in my own country today, where most daycare centres are in fact businesses selling products to parent consumers. Early childhood centres for Malaguzzi are not substitute homes. At the time that Reggio opened its first schools, the only existing schools were run by the church and were called scuola materna, motherly schools. That idea of them being substitute homes with motherly workers providing mother substitutes. So he rejects that idea. Early childhood centres are not for compulsory school. They are not scuola preparatoria. This concept, he says, completely contradicts certain beliefs we have, that children's education begins at birth. So he completely rejects what is very common in our discourse today, that early childhood should be places to ready or prepare children for school. He regards that as entirely unacceptable. And early childhood centres are not factories using human technologies to process children, which is an image, I think, very well captured in this cartoon by an Italian cartoonist, Frato, where you can see on the left-hand side children in all their richness entering in to this kind of factory building where they are being processed by human technologies. They're coming out all routinized and standardized on the right-hand side, and all the interesting and complex bits have been knocked off, and are poured out in a sort of refuse disposal chute at the bottom. I think a rather shocking but rather potent image of the early childhood centre as a factory for processing child outcomes. So what was Malaguzzi's image of the early childhood centre? First of all, he claims, well, his choice is that early childhood centres are schools. Now, he was very well aware that schools in Italy at the time did not have a good reputation. They were conservative, they were reactionary, they were confining and constricting, they were enclosed from their communities, they kept out other adults and parents. But he believed that schools could be renewed and reclaimed, and that in fact they were a very important idea that he wanted to develop in his early childhood centres. So his early childhood centres, his image of them is as schools providing education for children as a citizen right. They are an entitlement, a universal entitlement for all young children. They are scuola dell'infanzia, schools of early childhood, focusing on children and their rights. They are also living centres of open and democratic culture and places for creating culture in the wider society. So they have this role of nurturing democracy in the wider society and creating a culture of childhood and of rights in the wider society, in the city, beyond the school. And they are a public responsibility and a public space, completely open to families and local communities. They should, he said, no longer be seen as a separate institution, but participating in building and educating society. So again, he sees his schools always in relation to the wider society. What pedagogy do these rich children in these schools require? Well, again, he's very clear what pedagogy he doesn't want to see. He contests the dominant narrative's prophetic pedagogy that, and I quote from Malaguzzi, knows everything beforehand, knows everything that will happen, does not have one uncertainty. Prophetic pedagogy prophesies everything, sees everything to the point that it is capable of giving you recipes for little bits of actions, minute by minute, hour by hour, objective by objective. This is something so coarse, so cowardly, so humiliating of teachers' ingenuity, a complete humiliation for children's ingenuity and potential. So I think that idea of prophetic pedagogy very much embedded, I think, in today's dominant narrative, that story of quality and high returns, was, I think, quite abhorrent to him. A source of humiliation, a denial of potential. And he felt the same. He also felt the same about what he saw as the accompanying Anglo-Saxon testology. He saw testology as the accompaniment to prophetic pedagogy. This testology, with its rush to categorize, where it is enough to do some tests on an individual, and immediately the individual has been defined and measured in some way, which is nothing but a ridiculous simplification of knowledge and a robbing of meaning from individual histories. And in an era, in a time when we are subjected so much to standardized testing of younger children, I think this, in a nutshell, provides a powerful critique. For such testing is nothing, in Malaguzzi's words, but a ridiculous simplification of knowledge and a robbing of meaning from individual histories. So instead of prophetic pedagogy, Malaguzzi wants a pedagogy that is fit for rich children. And that is a pedagogy of relationships and of listening and of liberation. Going back to my earlier reference to Reggio Emilia as an example of progressive education, a tradition which has a very strong notion of education as an emancipatory project, a liberation. For Malaguzzi, his pedagogy is of children and adults co-constructing knowledge through processes of building, sharing and revising theories, always in dialogic relationship with others. It's a pedagogy that values and desires the unexpected and unpredictable, wonder and surprise. Wonder and surprise to Malaguzzi in a moment. And accompanying that rich pedagogy is a very important form of evaluation evolved by Malaguzzi and Reggio Emilia, pedagogical documentation, in which, as many of you will be aware, you make practice visible through many different forms of documentation, so that practice can then be subject of dialogue, reflection and interpretation, always in relationship with others. It's the antithesis of the standardized testing regime, the rating scale, the questionnaire to be filled out. A friend and colleague of Malaguzzi's, Alfredo Hoyles, describes pedagogical documentation as an extraordinary tool for dialogue, for exchange, for sharing. For Malaguzzi, it means the possibility to discuss and to dialogue everything with everyone, teachers, auxiliary staff, cooks, families, administrators, citizens, and to that we should add children, being able to discuss real, concrete things, not just theories and words. And the final political question I'm going to look at this evening is, what fundamental values? And here on the screen are just some of Malaguzzi's fundamental values. Cooperation and interconnectedness. He emphasizes the importance of everything being connected, and therefore of complexity. The value of subjectivity and uncertainty, the value of wonder and surprise, the value of research and experimentation, and the value of participation and democracy. And again, I have no time to go through all of those. I'll just pick a few of them just to give you a flavor of how Malaguzzi talks about them. Interconnectedness. Interconnecting, he says, is the great verb of the present and the future. A great verb we must be capable of understanding deep down and of conjugating as part of our hard work, bearing in mind we live in a world no longer made of islands, but in a world made of webs, in which interference, interaction, Interdisciplinarity is the constant, even when we cannot see it, even when we think it doesn't exist or it isn't there. Interdependence is there. Then uncertainty. Speaking to a meeting of teachers, Malaguzzi says, ours, teaching, is the profession of uncertainty. I believe uncertainty should be freed of its small degree of negativity and any denial of its virtuous nature. It must be brought back as a constituent element of our lives, of our relations with ourselves, with others, and with nature, as a constituent element of our growth. Uncertainty can be turned into something positive when we start to test it and see it as a state of ferment, a motor of knowledge. Note ferment and motor, that idea of pedagogy education has to be in a state of constant movement. If it stops moving, it dies, it becomes mummified. And uncertainty is one way in which we maintain movement, a ferment. And then surprise and wonder. He often writes about the importance of things that were not expected, that were unpredicted, that cause people to marvel. Perhaps the attitude that is necessary for adults working with young children, Malaguzzi says, is an attitude that remains open to wonder and to marveling. If you are equipped with this, you as an adult, then children will respond to you with a great openness to wonder and to marveling. And finally, democracy. And democracy is really such a fundamental value of Reggio Emilia. It's really important, especially coming out of their experience of 20 plus years of fascist dictatorship. Democracy was absolutely foundational for them. And for Loris Malaguzzi and the Schools of Reggio Emilia, democracy is lived out in many ways, in the pedagogy, in relationships, in everyday life, and also in the management of the schools. So parents participate in all aspects of school management. In fact, they've just held elections. They held 3 yearly elections to school management committees, and parents are part of that electoral process. And that school management, which parents participate in, is not just about administration. It's not just about counting paper clips. It's also about pedagogical and educational issues. Families must be taken from a passive position as pure consumers of a service and brought to an active, direct presence and collaboration, says Malaguzzi. Note how he rejects the image of parents as consumers of a service. They are active protagonists in the life of services. And here is another picture of Malaguzzi doing what I think he really loved doing, which was talking to study groups, visiting one of his schools, and obviously enjoying explaining the work, explaining the pedagogy, explaining the images and ideas that they worked with. So, I talked about the narrative that Loris Malaguzzi and Reggio Emilia have created, and my argument is that other people, other places can create their own narratives by following Malaguzzi's example and asking questions and making choices, and the choices will make up the narrative. But here's the thing, I think. Loris Malaguzzi knew that creating and telling a new story, a new narrative, is not enough. It needs to be enacted. It needs to be put into practice. So for transformative change, we need to ask, under what conditions is it possible? And Malaguzzi asks this question very early on. Almost the first document in the book is him writing an article as a journalist about how to renew culture in Italy after fascism. He writes, today we hope for a new expression of our art and our literature, and more than that, a new substance. However, waiting for the birth of an artist doesn't mean waiting for a miracle from heaven. True, we can't create artists at will, but it is equally true that the conditions for an artist to be born and develop can be created from now on. In other words, we can't pass a law creating artists, but what we can do is to create conditions in which artists will emerge and flourish. And similarly, we can create conditions in which transformative narratives can be born and flourish. And this, I think, is really important to understand. Reggio Emilia is the most successful example of progressive education ever. It lasted for 60 years. It extends to a network of 50 schools. And the reason for this is they are intensely practical. They're intensely focused on the conditions they need to make their education work. And here are just some of those conditions. First of all, the need for a fully integrated 0-6 early childhood system based in education. Most of the world, and particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, has split early childhood systems, split between childcare and early education or kindergarten. Reggio Emilia, like other advanced systems in the world, has a fully integrated 0-6 system in education. So there is no difference whether you're working with a child who is 18 months old or 3 years old or 5-year-old. The second condition is the school workforce. Rich children demand and need rich educators, and that requires proper pay. Malaguzzi wouldn't put up with the scandalously bad pay that so many early childhood workers today have to put up with. It is actually one of the most dreadful situations we find today, that so many early childhood workers find themselves on minimum wage. So for him, proper pay based on negotiation with trade unions and contracts is really important. Time for continuous professional development and other collegial activities. An end to what he called deforming solitude and humiliation. That meant a great importance attached to the group, to providing support, to solidarity, and working with a rich pedagogy. And also strong emphasis on cooperative and non-hierarchical working relationships. The schools work as cooperatives. He gives a lot of emphasis not only to teachers, but to assistants, to janitors, to cooks, to everybody working in the schools. And by the way, one of his conditions for his pedagogy is that each school must have a kitchen and a cook, and prepare fresh food for children every day. Some other conditions were included in the 1972 rule book for municipal schools produced by the local authority, by the city of Reggio Emilia. These conditions included pedagogical coordination or support from a team of pedagogistas and psychologists. So pedagogistas are very experienced educators who work with a small group, 2 or 3 schools, very intensively, supporting and working with the teachers. The provision of ateliers, art workshops, and atelieristas, people with an art background who work in a school alongside teachers. The daily presence in each class of at least 2 teachers. Importance attached to architecture and design. That means valuing all environments, indoors and out, as spaces of learning, including kitchens, bathrooms and gardens. And last but not least, participation by parents, democratic participation by parents, and the whole local area. And one final condition I would add to that, which I'm sure Malaguzzi would agree with, which is all of this must be supported by adequate public funding. Unfortunately, most of the Anglo-Saxon world does not give sufficient public funding to ensure adequate conditions for a good early childhood education. So, to conclude, Loris Malaguzzi and the Schools of Reggio Emilia contest today's dominant narrative of early childhood education, that story of quality and high returns. And they demonstrate that alternative narratives are possible and sustainable if we're prepared to ask political questions, if we're prepared to make political choices, and if we are prepared to analyse what are the necessary conditions to put our narratives into practice. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm waiting for the dialogue. Let's turn it over to our audience for, oh, I see the question box is already populating, so here we go.
Sorry, I have to start looking.
I'm hearing applause from Victoria. It wasn't a question yet.
Right, okay. Well, I'm also very happy to have comments, because how people respond or react to the argument I'm making. So questions or comments?
And I have a thank you from Irina.
Okay, thank you as well.
Now at UVic, they're passing out question cards, so they'll just be collecting those, and it will take a few moments to be able to feed those to us. I'll just see here, I'm just watching our screen here. So I wonder to the group, if you're feeling shy, remember you've got your hands up icon, and you can either type your question or comment in the chat bar, or you're welcome to speak to the group. And Peter asked a question, and I'm curious, what are our political questions?
I'd be very interested to hear any questions that you come up with, which you think are really important to address in creating a new narrative about early childhood education, or developing one that you're already working on.
And I'm hearing applause also from the students and faculty over at CapU.
Right.
And Rachel, we hope the students will be courageous. Maybe they'll find the first questions for us. Okay, we've got some comments coming here from Janice. Thank you for highlighting the notion of marveling, that as adults we need to inspire and nurture surprise and wonder. Rachel at CapU is writing from their group there, if not Reggio Emilia approach, then how would you like to name schools that embrace the pedagogy?
Well, are there any more coming just now, or should I respond to those?
Go ahead and respond to that. They're coming in fast and furious, so we have a list waiting for you.
I do think that I think the importance of wonder, surprise, marveling, whatever you want to say, is really critical to a different idea about pedagogy to the one that is very prevalent today, which would say that pedagogy is all about achieving predefined outcomes. In other words, we don't want to be surprised, because that would mean that we've gone off track. So I think what Malaguzzi and others are talking about it is an education which is about creating something new thought, new ideas, new understandings, something that hasn't been thought about before. So it's a very different idea about what education is. It's about the construction of new ideas and thinking, rather than the reproduction of what exists already. I think this question, I think that we should not say Now, the point about the Reggio Emilia approach is a really important one, and one that I'm puzzling over quite a lot, because I think at the end of the day, I would go back to the point that it's not possible to recreate a copy of the pedagogy in Reggio Emilia because of the particular context in which it emerges, particular context in which it exists. It comes out of a particular time, a particular place, a particular politics, particular economy, and so on and so forth. Now, what people can do, my argument would be, is to create their own narrative with their own pedagogy, and they will do that in relationship with Reggio Emilia. They may co-construct with Reggio Emilia, but what they do will be different. I mean, for example, if you are working in a First Nations community, that has its own context, which of course is hugely different to that of Reggio Emilia, and that would apply to any other context in British Columbia or elsewhere. So I think that we can work on our political choices. We can be provoked by Reggio Emilia, but we also always have to say, how does this work in our context? Is this the right choice for us? Is this the political choice we want to make in this time and place? I think some of the methods or ways of working may be more or less transferable. For example, project work and pedagogical documentation. But of course, they require an enormous amount of attention. And I think a tremendous attention to be given to the right conditions. I don't think something like pedagogical documentation can just be done like that. I think it has to be worked on very carefully. So I think I would come back to my earlier point. I see Reggio Emilia as a local project, just as in many other towns and cities in Italy, they created their local projects, which have much in common with Reggio Emilia, but are also quite distinctive. So I think we should think about creating local projects in relationship with Reggio Emilia, provoked by Reggio Emilia, learning from Reggio Emilia, but not being Reggio Emilia.
Thank you for that. And I also see a question here. Irina comments, I am from Russia and many points of your presentation correspond to memories from my childhood.
Right, that's interesting. For example, I'd be interested to hear what resonated.
Irina, do you want to unmute and speak to that or pop something in the chat box? Oh, there you're open, Irina.
Sorry, yeah, okay. Hello, I just, because you're talking about communal, how to say it in Italian. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yeah.
So it's about, I remember childhood, how to say, we all call it kindergarten, preschool center. Yep. So it was all also governed by the community where we were, and even parents, in a way, parents had to buy materials or renovate the building. So everybody was involved in making it better for the children. Parents were helping to build playgrounds. And I grew up in a Soviet system before the fall of the Soviet Union and during the fall. So I feel like, yes. So it feels like many things from the past are being crushed and being very negatively described, but it looks like from what you were talking about in Italy, the post-war system had many similar things that were present in other places, maybe like in Russia, people were trying to make the life as good as possible with what they had.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
and it's good to learn from each other.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an important point, because my understanding is that there were many, as you've just described, there were many good features about early childhood services in the Soviet Union, and of course they suffered very considerably after the fall of the Soviet Union. I don't know how far they managed to recover, because it's interesting. The Communist Party in Italy, of course, didn't govern nationally.
That's good.
It was excluded nationally. It was also, I think, a different. It was also so different, I think, to the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. It was, I think, it was more prepared to be open to democratic government, and
that's right.
Coexisted, as I've suggested, with a very successful capitalist economy, which is an interesting combination. And I think, obviously, I think that the Communist Party provided a local government context in which it was possible for people like Malaguzzi to develop this very progressive early childhood education. It created a very important political context. But of course, it's also important that Malaguzzi and others are influenced by many other people and movements. I mean, he is reading all the time. He is talking to lots of people. He is influenced, I think, by many other people in the progressive education movement. People, for example, like John Dewey, like Celestine Freinet, lots of other influences like that. So I think again, it comes back to this question of, can one talk about a Reggio Emilia approach? I think the Reggio Emilia project is constructed working with all of these influences from Italy and beyond. And when you're working in Canada, you're working with some of the same influences as Malaguzzi. And John Dewey, for example, may influence you, but you will be working with other influences. So again, it's not possible to be the same identity as Reggio Emilia, even though you find that there are things you share in common. So I think it's a difficult one. I think this question of how one relates to and thinks about Reggio Emilia is a really important one. And I come back to this. Yeah, anyway, I probably said enough about that. I'll leave it. But
thank you. I just want, sorry, can I add? I just had another part of my question. I talk about my preschool center as Reggio inspired. Is it better to say this way when I use things I learned from Reggio as Reggio inspiration?
I suppose so. By the way, I would say that Reggio Emilia used the term Reggio approach.
Okay.
I'm a dissident on this one. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, nothing to stop you just say Reggio Emilia. Do talk about the Reggio Emilia approach. You must decide for yourself. I guess you could say Reggio provoked, Reggio inspired. Working in dialogue with Reggio Emilia. I think there are various ways of trying to capture that idea of co-constructing knowledge, co-constructing a project with others.
Yeah, we have another question here. Maria asks, why was art so important to Loris Malaguzzi?
Well, I think first of all, because he was a very cultured man. He's a poet. He is a theatre critic. He's a theatre director. He's interested in all the arts. I think it's very important that he has very nice autobiographical pieces in the book Loris Malaguzzi and the Schools of Reggio Emilia, and he writes wonderfully about the theatre in Reggio Emilia after the war and so on. So I think for him, the arts were just obviously part of life and part of being a person. So obviously important. But I think he also, he developed this idea of the 100 languages of children, which of course is an idea that there are many, many ways in which children and adults can express themselves, can relate to the world. And this covers a wide range of artistic forms of expression, obviously painting, drawing, sculpture, montage, but also singing, dancing, I mean, just lots and lots of different ways. And for him, it's been explained to me by Carlina Rinaldi in her book, where she says that this idea came for people like Malaguzzi in the 1970s as a reaction to an excessive emphasis, in their view, given to two languages, literacy and numeracy. And they felt that those two languages privileged, already advantaged people. He thought these were the languages in which the privileged and the advantaged were very comfortable. And he wanted to open up and introduce more languages, including artistic languages, to actually, well, to advantage everybody, because he thought that children were born with 100 languages, and that if you stripped away 98 languages, you took away so much of the possibility of children and adults expressing themselves. And by talking about 100 languages, he wanted to privilege 100 languages and not just two. So I think for him, art is part of this idea of 100 languages as ways of expressing, of learning, of creating new understandings of the world. But it's important to see art as just some of the languages that he thought were important in actually the way in which we learn and relate to the world.
Thank you, Peter. There are a couple of questions here seeking some advice. Can you suggest resources that would, or advice on how to communicate these ideas to rigid systems so that the transformation can be more smooth?
Well, I just spent the last 9 days in the United States, and this question has come up everywhere, as it does wherever you are. And I have to say that I think the rigid systems, the tellers of dominant stories, they are rigid and tell these stories because they are very much inscribed, they very much embodied certain philosophical, political and cultural ideas. I would say that their rigidity and the sort of stories that they are comfortable with reflect a positivist paradigm, a very particular idea of how the world is. And I would also say probably a neoliberal view of society. And unfortunately, I haven't got time to go into that, but I think positivism and neoliberalism are really important perspective to understand the world is today. So I think even if you put these, if you talk about Reggio, how do you do it? They're going to find it very difficult to comprehend, because Malaguzzi and Reggio Emilia are living and working in a different paradigm. They're working with different perspectives. They have different language, different vocabulary. So it's not just a case, if only I found the right words, and everybody will say, oh, yes, I see, of course. I think we have to, I suppose my take on the situation is there's an increasing disenchantment with the rigid system, with the dominant narrative. People are looking for something else. There's a growing resistance movement. There are lots of examples of this. There's the reconceptualizing early childhood education movement. There is the whole Reggio Emilia international network. There's There are national and regional networks of people looking for something different. There are people writing, and so on and so forth. And I think at the moment what we have to do is actually improve our own understanding of alternatives, write, talk, share, work very much about developing these alternative narratives. We need to be able to tell convincing stories, and I've been trying to do that in some of my recent publications. But I think all of us need to be working on telling a different stories, and also equally important, and saying these stories are possible, but we need these conditions in place. Now, I think that the dominant narrative will not. I'm a historian by background, and if history tells us anything, it tells us that dominant narratives, the way the world seems, does not last forever. Things change. What seemed impossible 30 years ago today seems self-evident. So what seems impossible today in 30 years' time will seem self-evident. So I suppose what I think we have to be working for is not somehow some version of people who are very much lodged in a particular way of thinking, but for a time when the crisis comes, and I think crises are upon us already, and when the crisis comes, we have to be ready with alternative stories, which include the conditions necessary to enact those stories. So the bad news, if you like, is I don't believe in magical thinking, and I don't believe there is a magical solution to the current dominant discourse. The good news is I don't think it will last forever, and indeed I think it is beginning to crumble around the edges as people increasingly find it totally unsatisfying and unsatisfactory.
Thank you, Peter. I realize that we're coming to the end of our time here this evening. We do have a number of questions left on the board. I know that Peter has shared his email address generously. And Peter, if I were to share some of these questions with you, might you be able to look at these and perhaps send us a few thoughts on the remaining questions?
I would be delighted to do that. Yes, and any further, just please email me. I'm going to my bed now because it's 3:30 in the morning. But when I wake up, I will look at the questions and I will respond to them early next week.
Wonderful. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us throughout the province and the Yukon. And as many of you know, we are recording the sessions, so we will have a link available in the coming weeks if any of you missed. And your professional development certificates for those of you who registered will be coming by email in the next few weeks. So Peter, we wish you a very good night. Thank you for joining us and provoking and inspiring us. And sleep well. And good night to everyone else.
And good night to you, and thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you all.